Welcome to an Introduction to Zbrush 2020, a multi-part course that I will be uploading here on YouTube. In this first part, my goal is to equip new users with just the right amount of tools to begin sculpting right away. At the end, I will also provide an assignment in order to put the information you've acquired from this video to immediate use. Let me give you an overview of the topics I'll be covering in this part and what you can expect to learn. We'll start by setting up our preferences and optimizing performance when working. I will then introduce you to the user interface, and then we'll get into navigation, followed by some sculpting basics, where I'll introduce you to some of the common brushes that I use for sculpting, and finally, I'll do a narrated sculpting demo of a male head. Alright, so when you get Zbrush up and running for the first time, you're going to be greeted by this UI. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hide our lightbox, then head on over to Preferences and come down to Screensaver, and I'm going to turn our screensaver off. Now this is optional, you can do this if you want to. The important thing here is Undo History and Quick Save. Now I'm going to open up Undo History, head down to Maximum Undo History, and we can see that we have 10,000 instances. I'm going to bring that down to about 1,000. Now we don't want to have too many undo history instances because when we save our files, Zbrush stores the undo history instances as well. So the next time you open that file, what's going to happen is Zbrush is going to have to load all those instances as well. And so as a result, it's going to take about 5 to 10 minutes to get your file up and running. So that's something you need to be aware of. Now I'm going to head on over to Quick Save. And the first thing we see here is maximum duration, which means in this instance, Zbrush is going to autosave every 20 minutes. Now, if we come down to maximum quick save files, we can see that we have 1,000 files, which is quite a high number. So we're going to bring that down to something reasonable like, say, 5. Now, once we do this, we can head on over to configuration and we can hit store configuration. And I'm going to hit OK. So now our preferences have been incorporated. Alright, so before we move forward, there was another thing that I wanted to show you. So I'm just going to head on over to the lightbox and open a dynamic sphere, and I'm just going to start sculpting. And as I'm sculpting, you can see that there is this bar on top here that keeps getting updated. That is our undo history slider. So if I were to pull this behind, we can see that it's undoing our sculpt. And if I bring it forward, the opposite. So now let's say you were sculpting and you were in a good place and you wanted to delete your undo history. All we have to do is head on over to Edit and then hit Delete Undo History. And that slider there has now disappeared. Now, if I were to start sculpting again, it creates a new instance of undo history. So it is important to delete your undo history from time to time when you're happy with your sculpt, as it will help with your performance. So that concludes this section. I'll see you in the next. Let's go over the UI. So right at the top here we have the menu. Under that we have the shelf, as well as to the side here. On this end we have the palette, and to the extreme right we have the tray. Now this little thing right here is called a divider, and these can be collapsed by double clicking like so, and we have these on either end as well as at the bottom. Now this right here is the canvas, and if we come over here to the lightbox, we can access different projects, Z-tools, and some additional brushes and alphas. So for this part, we'll just be focusing on the dynamic sphere here, as well as the head plane. And for the sculpting demo, I'll be using the male head plane right here. Now on the left-hand corner at the top here, we have the thumbnail, where we can see the silhouette of our model. If we click and drag, we can adjust the size of it, and if we hold down Shift, we can snap at different increments. And on the right hand side, we have something similar to a view cube, where we can snap our model to the different views. So if we just drag, we can snap it to the side, to the top, to the front, and so on. Now in the navigation section, I'll be showing you how to use hotkeys to snap your model to different views. And with that, we can conclude this section. Now the UI in Zbrush is highly customizable, and we will be looking at that in a different part. In this section, we're going to take a look at navigation in Zbrush. So to rotate your object, all you have to do is hold down the left mouse button and drag. And in doing so, you can rotate your object in the viewport. Now to pan, all you have to do is hold down Alt and left mouse button and drag side to side, and you're able to pan. Now, when it comes to zooming, it's a little bit tricky, and there are two ways to do it. So the first way is by holding down Control and right mouse button, and dragging towards you will zoom in, and dragging away from you will zoom out. The other way of doing it is by holding down Alt and then your left mouse button, and then releasing Alt and dragging towards you to zoom in, and away from you to zoom out. Now to do a camera-based rotation, all you have to do is hold down Shift and then hold down left mouse button, and then release Shift and then drag, and you'll be able to rotate. Now I'm going to show you how to snap to different views. So if I turn this model off to the side, we can see more of his face than the side of his head. If I held down Shift and dragged with the left mouse button, it would snap to the front. Now if I turn this model off, in this case we can see more of the side than the front, and if I were to hold down Shift and drag, it would snap to the side. Same thing with the top of his head. If I were to do this, we see more of the top. If I held down Shift and dragged, it would snap to the top. And so that's how you snap your model to different views. Now, if you were to accidentally zoom into your model all the way in, all you have to do to get back is to frame your model, and the hotkey to frame your model is F. And now we're back to where we were. Let's now take a look at some of the sculpting basics. So I'm going to head on over here to the lightbox, and under project I'm going to select Dynamic Sphere. Once that's loaded, we can see that this grayed out area is now accessible, and this is our brush palette. So right now I'm on the standard brush, and to draw on top of our mesh, all we have to do is click and drag. To undo that, all we have to do is hold down Ctrl Z. Now to increase the size of our brush, we can do it in two ways. So the first way is by holding down the S key, and that gives us this draw size, which we can adjust by just moving the slider up and down. The other way of doing it is by holding down spacebar. The next thing I want to talk about is the Z intensity. And what the Z intensity does is it controls the strength of the effect of our brush. So if I move this up, you can see that the effect is intense, while if I move it to a low value, the effect is extremely subtle. Now I'm going to illustrate how the focal shift works. So if we hold down spacebar, we can access the focal shift, and right now it's got a negative value. So I'm just going to draw first with a negative value and then with a positive value. So first with a negative value, and then I'm going to set it to a positive value and then draw on top of this. Now you can see that the effects are quite different. So how focal shift works exactly is, if we have it set to a negative value, the intensity is concentrated on the extremities. And you can also notice a secondary feature. If you look at the brush, it's got a secondary circle, and right now if I decrease if I make the value positive on the focal shift, you can see that that secondary circle has now shrunk. So if I were to increase that to, if I were to set it at a negative value, the secondary circle increases in size, and if it's a positive value, it decreases in size. Now, if the focal shift is set to a positive value, what ends up happening is the stroke is a lot more concentrated in the middle, and if it's set to a negative value, the effect is concentrated on the extremities, therefore resulting in this more harder stroke, while the focal shift that had a positive value has a more softer look to it. Let's move on to the next thing, which is Z-add and Z-sub. Now, Z-add and Z-sub can be accessed on top here in the shelf, or by simply holding down spacebar. You can find it at the bottom here. So what Z-add does is it pushes your mesh out as you draw across the surface. And what Z-sub does is it basically carves into your mesh like so. Now, the hotkey for inverting your Z-add to Z-sub or Z-sub to Z-add is by holding down Alt. And it's as simple as that. So some brushes come with Z-sub as the default and some come with Z-add as the default. One of the brushes which come with Z-sub as default is the Damien Standard brush. So the hotkey for that is BDS. And this is what the Damien Standard brush looks like. Now I'm going to go over some of the different brushes that I use for sculpting. So the first one is the clay buildup brush, which is BCB, the hotkey, and then it's the move brush, which is BMV to access it, which basically just moves your mesh around like so. The other one is the Damien Standard brush, which is BDS to access it quickly. And to invert this, just hold down Alt and it gives you this sort of sharp lip. So the other brushes that I use are the inflate brush, which is BIN to quickly access it. Let's do that again. Yep. And this is pretty self-explanatory. It just inflates the region. Then the other brush that I use is the /3, which is like a knife tool, and this is a strong version of the Damien Standard. And the other brush is the smooth brush, which I can simply access by holding down Shift. So right now you can see we have a regular brush here, and if we hold down Shift, it switches to the smooth brush. So that's pretty much all the brushes that I am gonna introduce you to at this point, and these are mostly what I use for a lot of my sculpting. Also, you can activate symmetry by hitting X on the keyboard. Now you have symmetry active. You can also access it by coming up here to the transform menu and hitting the activate symmetry button. So the last thing I want to talk about is on how to save your file. So there are two ways of doing this. The first way is by going up here to the tool palette and clicking on Save As. So what that does is it allows you to create a Z tool. Now a Z tool basically just saves out your model as it is. The second way of going about this is by coming over to File and hitting Save As. Now what that does is it creates a Z project. Now a Z project saves a lot more information, like the direction of your model, your undo history, lighting, and so on. And so that's going to be a much more heavier file as opposed to the Z tool. Now let's get into the sculpting section of this tutorial. So I'm going to start off with the male head plane, and I'm not going to be using a dynamic sphere here because I'm trying to make this as beginner friendly as possible. So I'm going to start with the clay buildup brush, and I'm going to start building some of those important landmarks like the superciliary eminence, the eye socket, the zygomatic arch, angle of the jaw, and then I'm going to switch over to the Damien Standard brush to carve in the parting of the lips. Then I'm going to switch back to the clay buildup brush and continue to sort of exaggerate that superciliary eminence since we're working on a male head. Then I'm establishing the frontal eminence, and I'm continuing to build that form up, and I'm reviewing it from various angles. Then I'm working on the malar region, and And now I've started to move on to the nose, and I'm using the move brush here to just adjust the nose. I continue building up form with the clay build-up brush. Now I'm blocking out the eyes here, and I'm starting to establish that marionette line, and then carving in with the Damien Standard brush, and then switching back to the clay build-up brush. And I'm constantly switching back and forth between the Damien Standard to carve in shapes and the build-up brush to build up form. And now I'm working on the alar wing of the nose, and I'm cutting in that alar facial juncture and extending it into the loft line. Continuing to work on the lips, and I'm now using the Damien Standard brush. Then I switch back to the build-up brush and continue to define the lips. And all through, I'm looking at my model from different angles, just making sure that the forms read well and look good from all angles. And now I'm using the move brush to adjust some of my proportions. Now I'm building up the masseter muscle, and I'm working a little bit on the neck using the clay build-up brush. And now I'm using the move brush to move around the forms. Now I'm using the clay build-up brush to further define the features, and I'm working on the eye region. Now for this video, I'm not going to be sculpting the eye. I'm just going to leave them shut, and we'll be coming back in the next part to sculpt the eyes. So continuing to refine the area under the brow with the clay build-up brush, and using the Damien Standard tool the Damien Standard brush to just carve regions, and the move brush to move things around. Now the move brush is extremely fluid, and it helps you move large areas of your mesh very easily. Further refining the nose now, and I'm constantly reviewing the sculpt from different angles just to make sure everything is reading well. Continuing to define that masseter muscle and the cheeks. Now I'm going in with the move brush with the draw size set to a low value, and I'm carefully shaping the lips. One thing to keep in mind, the lips are never flat, they're set on a cylindrical surface. Continuing to change the angle and review my model, just making sure all the forms are reading well. Continuing to build up some form. Just gently refining things. Now I'm switching over to the Damien Standard brush, and I'm going to add in some more anatomical notes. So defining the lips, the mental line, adding in the juggle groove, building up some more form around the chin, and then dialing it back down, just making sure I have good control over my forms. Continuing to work on the temporal area. Switching over to the clay buildup now, and I'm starting to refine the area under the brow. Using the move brush to adjust my proportions. And sculpting some form under the jaw. Continuing to refine the angle of the jaw. Now I'm going to dial down those hard edges from our base mesh, and then I'm going to tone things down, make sure my forms are all in control. Using the move brush to continue editing my proportions, and now I'm starting to make more subtle changes to the forms and further refining it. Now I'm going to use the move brush to shape our ear, and the build-up brush to start sculpting. Continuing to shape the ear. Right now we've got these Dumbo-like ears, so I'm just going to go in and change those a little while later. For now, we're not going to focus too much on the ears. We'll be doing that in another video. So continuing to make some changes to the back of the head. Now I'm not going to include all the anatomical details. Sculpting in the mastoid process, the nuchal line. Now I'm adding in the sternocleidomastoid. Now these insert at the mastoid process of the temporal bone and the superior nuchal line. So continuing to sort of refine the neck, adding in the Adam's apple now. Just moving things into place. Continuing to make some more changes to the chin, adding in a little cleft. Carving in the marionette lines. Making some more very subtle changes. Up until this point we haven't used the smooth brush, and now we're going to start smoothing things out. Another thing to keep in mind is I'm not dragging the smooth brush over my forms, I'm gently tapping. Otherwise you risk losing all the details you just sculpted in. Now I'm sculpting in that sagittal crest, but I'm keeping things very subtle. We don't want to overdo these things. Continuing to make some changes near the temporal line and smoothing things out. Now I'm using the move brush to continue improving our proportions. Now it is recommended to use a reference when sculpting. For this video I just sort of did this off the top of my head. So it is recommended to use reference. Making some subtle changes to the nose, adding a little bit more character to it. Making slight tweaks to the eye as well. Now I'm using the clay buildup brush to further refine our lips, and the Damien standard to cut in some shapes. Further working that frontal bone. Smoothing things around. Now that temporal line was a little bit too harsh, so I'm dialing it down. Now, most of the changes that we're going to do are going to be extremely subtle. Continuing to make some changes to the back of the head. Now you can see me using the clay buildup brush, and there's a little bit of an issue. So I'm going in with the inflate brush to sort of resolve that. What ends up happening is if you sculpt on a very thin surface with the clay buildup brush, you tend to cause holes in your mesh. So one way of resolving that is by using the inflate brush. So I'm just now moving those ears in, shaping things up. Unfortunately, we don't have enough resolution at this point, and I'm not going to subdivide my mesh at this point. So you'll see me adding in some details, but then I'm just going to dial it back because we just don't have enough resolution at this point. We'll be subdividing our mesh in the next video. For now, I just want to focus on the features of the face and just getting a general sense of the head down. Further defining that alar wing as well. Now I'm sort of reviewing my sculpt, making some more subtle changes. Looking at things from different angles and pulling things out. looking at my model from top as well. Now I'm using the Damien standard brush to carve in the nostrils and some more very subtle changes, using the built-up brush to sort of add a little bit more to the forms. Dialing back the cheekbone a bit. Now in this model the zygomatic bone is a little bit too low, and so when I come back in the next video I'm going to start making some changes to that. Now I'm just going over that temporal line again and continuing to sort of develop that malar region. Now I'm going to carve in to make some space for the lower lid. So now I'm sculpting in the lower lid with the clay build-up brush. And for a second there, you can see that I lose some pressure sensitivity. So now I'm using the Damien standard to carve in. And I'm smoothing things out. Then I'm pulling back and just making sure everything looks okay. Continuing to make very, very subtle changes. Just adding in some more form. Now I'm carving in with the Damien standard brush and using the clay buildup brush. So for the most part it's pretty much the same thing, just rinse and repeat of the move brush, the Damien standard brush, and the clay buildup brush. Now I'm using the move brush to sort of shift things around a little bit more. Starting to add in some final touches to this. Just working on that ear a little bit more. Unfortunately, there's not enough resolution to add too much detail to it, so I end up toning it all back down. So now I'm just making subtle changes with the clay buildup brush. Moving things around with the move brush again. And that zygomatic bone ended up getting way too low. Continuing to make some room for that lower lid and make sure that thing transitions properly. Now I'm using the slash brush to create a deeper cut, and this is a much more powerful cutting tool than the Damien standard brush. So I'm just continuing to move things around and make very, very subtle changes at this point. Continuing to smooth things out after I sculpt over. Now for the homework assignment, sculpt 2 male heads and 2 female heads using the head planes that can be found in the lightbox under the project section. And this brings us to the end of part 1. I hope this video was informative. Thanks for watching and see you in part 2.